Corvin's mule refused to move first. That was how he knew something was wrong. The animal stopped dead on the thornback road, nostrils wide, one ear pinned flat. Corvin clicked his tongue, nudged its flank with his heel, said its name twice. The mule did not move. It stood with the particular stillness of a creature that has already made up its mind. Corvin climbed down and walked ahead on foot. The ravine dropped off the left side of the road, a long crack in the earth, deep enough that the bottom stayed in shadow most of the day. He had walked this road 40 times. He knew where the path narrowed, where the loose stones gathered, where the cliff swallows nested in spring. He knew this road the way poor people know every inch of the ground between them and the nearest market, because the walk costs something each time. He heard it before he saw it. A sound from the ravine floor, not animal, not wind, something between a scrape and a cry, the sound of something trying very hard to do something that hurt. He looked over the edge. The rockslide must have happened the night before. A section of the ravine wall had come loose, slabs of grey stone stacked on each other at the bottom, and beneath the outermost slab, something was pinned. Corvin could see a wing. One wing, extended at a wrong angle, the membrane thin enough that the afternoon light came through it in dark veins. The color was off, too dull, too unsettled, the way a bruise looks before it decides what shade it will be. He knew what it was. Every child in the farming villages east of Veldern learned the 3 rules before they learned to read. Do not approach a nest, do not touch an egg, and if you find a hatchling alone, walk away and do not look back. The rules existed because of what happened to families that broke them. The stories were specific, and they were told to children on purpose, with detail. Corvin stood at the edge of the ravine for a long time. The thing beneath the rock made the sound again. It was not a roar. Hatchlings that young do not roar. It was something smaller and more honest than that, a sound that had nothing left in it except the bare fact of pain. He climbed down. The ravine floor was wet from last night's rain, the stones slick and uneven. He lost his footing twice on the way down and caught himself both times on outcroppings that cut his palms. By the time he reached the bottom, his hands were bleeding from 2 places, and his right knee was singing with pain from the second fall. He did not approach the hatchling directly. He moved to the slab first, keeping himself to the side, out of the line of those yellow eyes, which were open and very still, and watching him with an expression he could not name. Not fear, not rage, something else. Something that looked strangely like resignation, the look of a creature that has already decided what is going to happen next and has accepted it. He put his shoulder against the slab and pushed. It did not move. He repositioned, found a lower center of gravity, the way his father had taught him when they moved millstones, and pushed again. The slab ground sideways by 1 inch. 2. The hatchling pulled its wing inward with a sound that made Corvin's jaw tighten. He pushed until the edge of the slab cleared the wing entirely, and then he stepped back. His hands were leaving red marks on the grey stone. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, and his knee was going to be ugly tomorrow. He was also going to be walking home in the dark, because the time he had lost here meant he would not make the road back before sundown. He opened his pack. Half a cured rabbit haunch, wrapped in cloth, a skin of water, mostly full, a small knife he used for everything, 3 copper coins that were supposed to last him the week. He set the rabbit on the stone floor between them and stepped back to the ravine wall. The hatchling did not move for a long time. Then it moved toward the food in the way that young things move when they have been hurt and are very hungry and are not yet sure the danger is past, slowly, with its weight low, ready to stop at any moment. It reached the rabbit and swallowed it whole, bones and wrapping cloth and all, without pausing. Then it sat back and looked at him. Corvin looked back. The hatchling's scales were shifting even as he watched. The light seemed to pull different colors out of them, like oil on water. Nothing settled yet. The eyes stayed the same throughout. Yellow, wide, fixed on him with an attention that felt too heavy for something that size. He poured some water into his cupped hand and held it out. The hatchling leaned forward, and drank from his palm. He stood there with water dripping through his fingers until the skin was empty, and then he straightened up. His knee had stiffened while he crouched. He flexed it carefully, looked up at the ravine wall, looked back at the hatchling. It was already climbing. The wrong-angled wing held close against its body, using only its legs and the right wing for grip, moving up the rock face with the instinctive competence of something born to vertical surfaces. It reached the top. It did not look back. Corvin climbed after it slowly, with his bleeding hands and his bad knee, and emerged onto the road in full dark. The mule was still there, still waiting. He packed up his empty sack, got back on the road, and said nothing to anyone when he got home. There was nothing to say. The mule had waited. He had moved some rocks. He had given away his food. That was all. That was everything. The first refugee came through Brackfen on a Tuesday, which Corvin remembered because Tuesdays were when he reconciled the garrison's supply logs, and he had ink on his fingers when the man arrived. The man's name was Dunnet. He had walked for 4 days from a village called Ashbury in the northern reaches of Osmark. He had no shoes. He had one child on his back and a second holding his hand, and he told whoever would listen that Ashbury did not exist anymore, that the sky had opened, that the thing that came down from that sky was not a natural fire. Corvin listened from the doorway of the granary. He had spent 20 years being careful not to think about the ravine. It was not a decision he made once and held to. It was something he did every time the subject of dragons came up at the garrison table, every time a merchant passed through with northern gossip, every time the scholars at Calford published something new about dragon behavior and it got read aloud in the common hall. He would let the words go by and think about grain counts instead. He was very good at grain counts. He was the best supply warden Brackfen had ever had, which was a small thing to be the best at, but it was reliable. Dunnet was the first refugee. By Thursday, there were 11. By the following week, there were 300, and Corvin had stopped sleeping properly. He listened to every account he could find. He did this quietly, the way he did most things, not conspicuously, not urgently, just thoroughly. He sat with the refugees at meal times. He asked careful questions. He wrote nothing down. What emerged from the accounts was consistent in its details. The thing in the north was a single dragon. It circled before it struck, always once, always slow. It did not attack moving columns of people fleeing. It struck buildings and walls and granaries, the structures that held communities together. It was dismantling the architecture of civilization in the north, deliberately, one settlement at a time. And it was young. The scholars in the later dispatches from Calford said this with a particular kind of alarm. A dragon of this power and precision should be centuries old. This one was not yet 25 by any reasonable estimate. Something had pushed it past every normal stage of development at a speed that had no precedent in any record. Corvin sat with that for a very long time. He did the math. He had done it before in small pieces in the dark and always stopped himself before he finished. He finished it now, 20 years. A hatchling in a ravine with a crushed wing and no nest, yellow eyes and the look of something that had already decided it knew what came next. He went to find Hesse. She was the garrison commander, had been for 6 years, would be until the garrison was no longer garrison or she was no longer breathing. She was not a kind woman, but she was fair and she did not waste people's time, which Corvin had always considered more valuable than kindness in someone with that much authority. He told her everything. She listened without expression. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she believed he had helped a hatchling in a ravine 20 years ago. She said she was willing to accept that the hatchling had survived and grown powerful. She said that none of this changed what she needed to do, which was move 4,000 people south before something with wings and fire reached the river crossing at Brackfen. He said he thought there was another option. She looked at him the way people look at someone they respect, who is saying something they cannot respect. She said, "You are a supply warden, Corvin." He said, "Yes." She said, The Dragon King of the Northern Territories has burned 11 settlements in 8 months. What exactly do you think a supply warden is going to do about that? He did not have a good answer. He had an answer, but it was not a good one. It was the kind of answer that depended on a 20-year-old memory and the hope that a creature which had become the most powerful dragon in recorded history had not also become something that no longer remembered an afternoon in a ravine. He asked her for 3 days before she began the full evacuation. He asked her to give him a head start north. She refused him. He thanked her and left. He spent the rest of the day finishing the supply logs because the work still needed to be done, and it would be harder for whoever took over if he left them in disorder. He organized the grain allocation sheets, filed the courier receipts, labeled the unfinished ledger with a note explaining where he had stopped and what remained. He packed a single bag that night, dried food for 5 days, a water skin, a small knife, nothing else. He was not going to war. He had no useful equipment for war and no training that would make any difference against what was waiting in the north. He left before the garrison woke. He had been walking for 2 hours when he heard footsteps behind him. He stopped and turned. Pell was 17. He was Brackfan's fastest courier, which meant he knew every road in a 30-mile radius and could run them in weather that stopped horses. He was also, at this moment, carrying a travel pack and wearing the expression of someone who has made a decision and would prefer not to debate it. Corvin told him to go back. Pell said he would not. Corvin told him again. Pell said someone should see whatever happens, someone should be able to say it was real. Corvin looked at him for a long moment, then he turned around and kept walking. He did not tell Pell to follow, and he did not tell him to leave. He simply walked north, and Pell walked behind him, and neither of them spoke again until the sun was fully up. On the second day north, the birds disappeared. Not gradually, 1 hour they were there, sparrows in the scrub and crows overhead arguing about something in a field, and then Corvin looked up, and there was nothing. Empty sky, the kind of silence that makes the inside of your ears feel hollow. Pell noticed it too. He did not say anything. He just stopped walking for a moment and looked around, and then he hitched his pack up higher and kept going. The first burned village was called Westing. Corvin knew it from supply routes. It had a good well and a cooperage that sold barrels at fair prices. The cooperage was still standing structurally. The roof was gone. The walls were black from the inside out, which meant the fire had come from within, not from the outside in, the way normal fires spread. The heat had been intense enough that the stone of the well coping had cracked in places, which should not have been possible. He stood in the center of what had been the market square and looked at the walls around him and tried to think about whether any of this was rational. Any part of it. Whether walking toward the source of this, with nothing but a story, was something a sane person did. He could not find a good argument for it being sane. He also could not find a good argument for turning back, because turning back meant 4,000 people in Brackfan, with no one doing the one thing that might make any difference at all. Pell found something in the ruins of the cooperage, a barrel that had survived intact, sealed at both ends, rolled into a corner. He broke the seal with the handle of his knife. It was full of salted pork. They ate standing up in the remains of Westing, because sitting down felt wrong. On the third day, they climbed the ridge above the burned valley. Corvin had heard accounts of what a Dragon King's resting ground looked like. The accounts were from people who had seen it from a distance and survived to describe it, which was a small and specific group. The valley below the ridge fit every description, a wide flat floor of granite, too smooth for a natural formation, the surrounding stone blackened to a depth that suggested heat maintained over time rather than a single burst. No trees, no growth, nothing that could burn had been left to burn. And in the center of it, coiled loosely on the granite, was the Dragon King. Corvin had prepared himself for the size intellectually. He had measured the accounts in his head, wingspan estimates, body length comparisons, the shadows that survivors described. He had done this on purpose, so that when he saw it, he would not be entirely unprepared. He was still unprepared. The Dragon King was vast in the way that geography is vast, not just large but scale-altering, the kind of presence that makes you recalibrate the size of everything around it. The valley was not small. The valley looked small. 4 lesser dragons were positioned at the cardinal points around it, each one larger than anything Corvin had ever seen before, each one looking like a minor detail against the central figure. The color was slate blue, deep, like storm water over granite, like the underside of a sky just before serious weather. The scales had settled completely, no shifting, no uncertainty. This was a creature that knew exactly what it was. Pell made a sound next to him, not words, just a sound. Corvin was looking at the eyes. From the ridge, he could not have identified their color with certainty. The distance was too great, but the Dragon King's head was turned in the direction of the southern ridge, their direction, and the eyes were open, and even from this distance, they caught the light in a way that made them visible. A pale, bright color, a color that reflected rather than absorbed. Yellow. He stood on the ridge for a long time. Behind him, somewhere in the south, Hesse was loading 4,000 people onto barges and wagons and organizing them into columns that would take weeks to arrive safely at the next settlement. Behind him were the burned remains of Westing and 2 other villages he could not name from the ash alone. Behind him were the accounts, 11 settlements, the Northern Army gone, Calford's council arguing about tribute terms to a creature that had not asked for tribute. In front of him was the one thing in the world that had been moving steadily south for 8 months and had not been stopped by anything human hands had tried. He turned to Pell. He told Pell to stay on the ridge. He told him clearly and specifically, stay, watch, and if fire starts, run south and do not stop. He told Pell that whatever he saw should be remembered accurately, not well, not kindly, not in a way that made anything sound better than it was. Accurately, the true version of it, whatever that turned out to be. Pell said he understood. Then he asked, what if it works? Corvin thought about that. He had spent 3 days walking, and he had thought about a great many things, but he had not spent much time on what success looked like. He had been occupied with the more pressing question of what failure looked like. He said, if it works, you write it down exactly as it happened. No better, no worse. Pell said he would. Corvin went down the ridge alone. His boots on the stone made a small sound that seemed too loud and too small at the same time. The 4 lesser dragons saw him before he was halfway to the valley floor. He could tell from the way their heads moved, tracking, adjusting. None of them came toward him. They held their positions. The Dragon King did not move at all, but its eyes followed him all the way down. Corvin stopped 40 feet away. Not because he chose that distance deliberately. He stopped because his legs stopped, and after a moment of arguing with them internally, he decided 40 feet was close enough. The Dragon King's head was the size of a wagon. Corvin was aware of this the way you are aware of all the measurements that suddenly become real rather than theoretical. A number he had heard, a number that was now right in front of him, attached to a living thing that was watching him with yellow eyes that had not blinked since he came off the ridge. He had decided not to kneel. He had considered it on the walk down and decided against it, not from pride but from honesty. He had not knelt to anything in his life. Starting now felt like a performance rather than respect, and this creature, whatever else it was, had spent 20 years becoming powerful enough that nothing could require it to accept performances. He stood straight. He said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected, which surprised him enough that he nearly lost the thread of what he was saying, that he did not know if the Dragon King would remember him. He said he was not certain a creature that had lived through what it had lived through and become what it had become would hold on to something as small as one afternoon in a ravine. He said 20 years ago, on the Thornback Road in the eastern farmlands of Veldern, I found a hatchling pinned under a rock slide. I moved the rocks. I gave it the food I had with me. Then I climbed back up the road and walked home and said nothing to anyone, because there was no one who would have believed me and nothing useful I could have done with the telling of it. He paused. The valley was utterly silent. He said, I am here because I think you have been looking for something, and I think it might be this. I am here to find out if I am right. The Dragon King's eyes did not leave him. One of the four surrounding dragons shifted its weight, a sound like a building settling, like stone grinding on stone. The Dragon King made a sound back, single syllable. The subordinate dragon went still. The silence returned. Corvin waited. He was good at waiting. 20 years of supply work had taught him that patience was not a virtue so much as a tool, the thing you used when all the other tools had been tried and returned no result. He stood in the burned valley with his bleeding healed hands at his sides and waited. The Dragon King spoke. The voice was not built for the space between human eardrums. It arrived as pressure more than sound, a deep vibration that Corvin felt in his chest, in his back teeth, in the soles of his feet through the granite. But the words resolved. They assembled themselves in his understanding, the way meaning sometimes arrives ahead of sound, the way you know what a person is saying before they finish the sentence. The Dragon King said, "You are smaller than I remembered." The world continued to exist. Corvin breathed. He felt something shift in his chest, not relief, not yet, something more careful than relief, a sensation like the first moment when you realize the floor you were unsure of is going to hold. He said, "You were smaller too." One of the subordinates moved with sudden aggression, a lurch forward, scales scraping stone. The Dragon King stopped it with the same kind of sound as before. Quiet, absolute. The subordinate retreated. The Dragon King looked at Corvin for a long moment. Then it asked a question. One word in the old tongue, carrying a weight that the word in Veldurnian would not quite hold. Corvin understood it anyway. It was the oldest question anything trapped had ever wanted to ask the person who let it out. Why? Corvin had not prepared an answer to this. He had prepared for the possibility that the Dragon King would not remember him at all. He had prepared for the possibility that remembering him would not be enough. He had not prepared for this because he had assumed the answer would be obvious, and now that the moment was here, he realized the answer was not obvious at all. It was just true, which was a different thing. He said, "I didn't want you to die hungry and alone in a hole in the ground. That's the whole of it. I didn't think about what you were or what you might become. You were pinned and hungry and hurt, and I had food and two hands that could move rocks. That's all." He said there was no reason beyond that. The Dragon King was quiet for a very long time. Then it said, and this was said simply, with none of the weight that followed it in Corvin's memory for the rest of his life, until the moment he said it, it said, "I have burned 17 settlements. I was looking for you." Corvin heard this. He stood with it. He understood in the space of one breath what it meant, the full scope of it, the dead, the ruins, the desperate refugees, the army that did not come back. He understood that the search had cost things that could not be returned. He felt the weight of it settle onto him, all of it at once, like a stone slab. He did not look away. He said, "Then it's good that I came." He said, "Because I'm here now, and I'm listening." Pell came down from the ridge on the second day, which no one had told him to do. Corvin heard the footsteps and did not turn around, because turning around would have meant turning his back on the Dragon King, and he was not ready to do that. Pell settled himself on a low stone 20 feet behind Corvin and to the left, close enough to hear, far enough to be clearly not part of whatever this was. He pulled a courier receipt from his pack and began to write on the back of it with a stick of charcoal. The Dragon King's eyes moved to Pell once, assessed him, returned to Corvin. The conversations, if they could be called that, happened in pieces. The Dragon King did not speak continuously. It would say something or ask something and then go silent for hours. Corvin answered when there was something to answer and waited when there was not. He slept in short stretches when the silences went long. He ate from his pack without embarrassment. On the first night, Pell silently passed him half of what he had brought, and Corvin ate it without comment. On the second morning, the Dragon King explained the life debt. It came out in fragments, old concepts in a tongue not built for human use, assembled by Corvin from pieces the way you assemble something broken. The dragon hierarchy had a law older than any of its other laws. A life freely preserved created an obligation that ran until it was released or repaid. The debt did not care about species. It did not care about size or power or intention. A life preserved was a life preserved. The law was without exception. A hatchling carrying an unresolved life debt to a human was vulnerable. The debt created a gap in the dominance hierarchy, a point of contest that other dragons could challenge, a weakness that older and stronger dragons could identify and press. The Dragon King had spent its first years in the hierarchy fighting against this vulnerability from every direction, which meant it had to fight harder and faster and more ruthlessly than anything its age had any right to. The debt that Corvin had created with one afternoon's work was part of the engine that had driven a 20-year-old dragon to a title that should have taken centuries. It needed power sufficient to search openly. Corvin sat with this for a long time. He said finally that he had not known any of that was possible. He said he had moved the rocks and given away his food and gone home, and he had assumed that was the end of it. The Dragon King said, "I know, that is what makes the debt real." On the second evening, Corvin asked the question he had been holding since the first day. He asked what repayment looked like. The Dragon King was quiet for a long time. Then it said that in the old tradition, repayment was determined by the one who held the debt. Whatever Corvin named was what the Dragon King was bound to provide: territory, safety for his bloodline, fire withheld from the lands he specified. Corvin said he did not want any of those things. The Dragon King's head turned slightly. It was a small movement, but in something that large it felt significant, the way a small shift in wind matters when you are sailing. Corvin said, "A debt paid under compulsion is not settled, it is transferred. If you stop burning because a law requires you to, that means nothing to me and probably means nothing to you. If you stop because you choose to, that's different. That's worth something." He said, "I didn't feed you because of a rule. I did it because I decided to. I'm asking you to do the same, not to repay a debt, to make a choice." Pell was writing very quickly on the back of the manifest. The Dragon King said nothing for the rest of the second day and through the third night. Corvin slept more than he expected to. He woke before dawn and sat on the granite looking at the sky until the light came, the way it does in high country, not from one direction, but from everywhere at once, grey becoming gold, becoming real. The Dragon King rose at mid-morning of the third day. It was not a thing you could prepare for, even having seen it coiled for 2.5 days. The sheer physical fact of it, the sound of those wings unfolding, the way the air pressure changed, the way the granite seemed to remember its weight even as it lifted. The 4 subordinates rose around it in a slow circle. The Dragon King looked down at Corvin. The shadow it cast covered the entire valley floor. It said, "The debt is settled, by choice, as you asked." Corvin nodded. He could not speak for a moment. Which was the first time in 3 days that had happened. Then the Dragon King said one more thing. It said, "Tell your people what happened here, not the version that makes us monsters, not the version that makes you heroes. The version where a boy moved rocks and gave away his food and a hatchling remembered it for 20 years. That is the only version worth keeping." The wings spread fully, and the sound was like weather. The subordinates followed. They went north in a line, the Dragon King at the center, the formation growing smaller against the sky until it was gone and the sky was just sky. Corvin stood in the empty valley for a while. Pell came up beside him. He had filled both sides of 3 courier receipts, tight charcoal writing, some of it smeared at the edges where his hand had dragged. He said, "I got most of it." Corvin said, "Good." They turned south. Nobody believed Pell at first. This was predictable. He was 17 and had arrived back in Brackfen with smeared charcoal notes written on grain manifests, claiming to have witnessed a 3-day conversation between a supply warden and the Dragon King of the Northern Territories. The garrison had been mid-evacuation when Corvin left and had not stopped being mid-evacuation since. Hessa listened to Pell's account with her arms crossed, and her expression the particular kind of flat that means a person is deciding how seriously to take what they are hearing. When Pell finished, she asked where Corvin was. Corvin walked in through the granary door at that moment, still carrying his empty pack, still wearing the clothes he had left in 6 days ago. Hessa looked at him for a long time. She said, "You went north." He said, "Yes." She said, "You talked to it." He said, "3 days." She said, "And you're alive." He said, "It would seem so." She uncrossed her arms. She pulled a chair out from the supply table and sat down heavily, the way people sit when their legs have simply made a decision independent of their intentions. She said, to the room in general, that somebody should stop loading the barges for a moment. The news moved the way fire moves in dry grass, not because anyone organized it, but because it had its own momentum and the conditions were right. The evacuation paused, then it stopped, then people came back. The confirmation came 8 days later from a mounted courier from Osmark. The fires in the north had stopped, completely. A scouting party sent into the burned territories had traveled 40 miles without encountering a dragon. The Dragon King had not been sighted south of the Delvian Range. Pell's account circulated, not because anyone in authority chose to distribute it. He had written it on salvage paper in charcoal that smeared, and no one initially treated it as anything more than a strange personal record. It circulated because people copied it and passed the copies, because human beings, when they find a story that feels true, cannot leave it alone. Scholars at the Calford University got hold of a copy and spent 3 months arguing about whether any of it was credible. Then a delegation of dragon scholars, the kind who spent their lives studying dragon behavior from safe distances, reported that 3 separate dragons in the Northern Territories, when approached through established diplomatic channels, confirmed that the Dragon King had resolved a life debt. The word they used was the old tongue word. The scholars said it translated approximately as settled. Corvin went north to help with the Reconstruction. This was not a symbolic gesture or a political statement. Brackfen needed its supply warden, but the northern settlements needed people who could manage logistics in ruined infrastructure more urgently, and he was one of maybe 40 people in the region with the specific competence the work required. He organized grain movement, calculated shelter requirements, coordinated with the labor columns coming up from the south. He was very good at it. He had always been very good at this kind of work. He did not speak publicly about the valley. He answered questions when people asked directly, and he answered them the way Pell had recorded it, plainly, without embellishment, without the parts that made him sound better than he was. He corrected versions of the story that got details wrong, which was most of them. 6 months after Brackfen, the first formal contact between human representatives and the Northern Dragon hierarchy took place in the ruins of a city called Tanveld. Corvin was not part of the delegation. He was 3 miles away at the time, counting lumber shipments. But the delegation had Pell's account in their saddlebags. They had it because the lead representative, a diplomat from the Free Cities who was more pragmatic than anyone gave him credit for, had read it 6 times and concluded that the only reason anyone was sitting at this table, instead of burning or being burned, was a story written in charcoal on grain manifests by a 17-year-old courier who had refused to stay on a ridge. The negotiations were slow and failed twice before they produced anything. Progress between species with 1,000 years of mutual fear and contempt is not a matter of one good conversation. It is a matter of 10,000 difficult ones, and most of them go badly. But they happened. That was the thing. They happened at all. On a cold morning in late autumn, Corvin made the supply run along the Thornback Road for the first time in years. The northern routes were open again, and the depot he was supplying in what remained of the border settlements needed more grain before the first snow. He passed the ravine. He had not planned to stop. He stopped anyway. The rockslide was still there. He had only moved enough of it 20 years ago to free one wing. The rest had settled and stayed. The ravine looked the same as it always had, deep, shadowed, cold. the kind of place you wouldn't notice if you weren't already looking. He stood at the edge for a while. He was not thinking about what he had done. He was not measuring it or being proud of it or wondering how things would have gone differently. He was thinking, simply and without drama, about the hatchling's face in the moment before he set the food down, that waiting look, already certain of what a human being was going to do. He had decided, in that moment, not to be that version of a human. That was it, that was the whole of it, not heroism, not strategy, not the weight of the world balanced against one decision, just a man on a road looking at something that was hurt, deciding who he wanted to be. He got back on the road. He went north. The work was waiting.